What was I going to do? Okay, so the airport challenge is a test-driven development challenge, trying to think about how we convert sort of those user stories into requirements. And I wanted to sort of not demonstrate, but go over like one part of it, how we can get the airport and the plane working together. And I'll give you sort of like an example of this. And so as I look through some of your submissions, you're all pretty much on the right lines here, which is really good to see. But the hint I gave you on Friday about planes being in control of their own state is a useful one to think about, because it helps demonstrate one of these ideas about how we can encapsulate logic in the plane and how we can encapsulate logic in the airport and then still use them together. So I'm going to share my screen in a second. Cool. Just give me a quick thumbs up if you can see my screen. Cool, nice. Let's make you all very small. Okay, let's make this a bit bigger so we can see. So I've just cloned down the airport challenge again, so I'm in an absolutely empty directory here at the moment. And a lot of you had something similar to this, where we had an airport where when we created a new instance of our airport, we had some kind of capacity. Let's keep it a very small airport to begin with, some kind of provincial, rural, one landing strip, only has 2 planes, all right? Let's do something like this. Okay, let's just stop there for a second. Give me a quick thumbs if you understand what line 2 in the argument, what that does. Give me a quick thumbs. Cool. So as a quick recap, if I don't pass in an argument to my new constructor, so if I use something like this, new airport like that, it uses the default argument. However, I can override it with a different number, and I would store either 5 or 2 in this case at this property. All right, so I can have a way to override a default capacity. So that essentially is one of the user stories, doing something like this. All right, keeping it super simple. Right, a lot of you create another method to write to directly. That's absolutely fine. That's arguably a good interpretation of user stories. But always feel free to keep it as simple as possible. Right, and that arguably is enough. We don't need, in the moment, we're not really thinking about real interfaces to our programs. We're just thinking about objects and how they talk to each other. As the weeks go by, we're going to add interfaces. And by that, I mean like someone actually using a program on the command line or on a web interface. So a lot of these user stories are written in such a way that you can, at the moment, just use objects rather than having to think about an interface. Okay, so and then a lot of you did something like this to store plances. All right, okay, to store the sort of objects in the array. Feels good. And then a lot of you had like a land method that takes in a plane. You probably did something like this, where you wanted to have like a sort of an if condition with a bunch of different conditions, and that feels good. All right, so you probably did something like this, and you probably did a few checks here to sort of like make sure that what we call guard conditions. So if certain conditions are met, we return early. Otherwise, the last thing we're going to do is what we want to do, which is insert an item into the array, and then return maybe the planes. So that's kind of the structure of what a lot of you've done, which is very reasonable. And some of the user stories mentioned things like if the array is at capacity, we can't land any more planes. So the first guard condition might be something like if this plane's length is greater than or equal to this dot capacity, maybe do something like this. Return soz full. Something like that. Some of you might have extracted this, as we did in Bob's Bagels challenge, maybe, to a method for readability's purpose, is full. And remember, and for you are still doing this, this is all you need to do to return true or false. We don't need to have an if condition. If true, then return true. So this evaluates to true or false, then we can return it. There's no need to say if this evaluates to true, then also return true. It's implicit. So remember that, right? That's redundant to do something like if right? Does that make sense to everyone? This is redundant. You don't need this. All you need to do is, because this still evaluates to true, so you're saying if true, return true, or if false, return false. That's madness. Just return the result of that evaluation. What else have you? What else did I see? If it's full, if this dot planes includes a plane, and then return another message already here. Does that feel similar to what a lot of you have done? A few nods. Cool. Anything outrageously different? Anything reasonably different? Cool. Everything so far looking like it makes sense. Just give me a quick thumbs up that it's like making sense. If there's anything on all the 20 lines of code that we have that you want to go over, you want to be like, what does that line do? And this is the time to go over it, and I'm very happy to go over as much as we need to. Cool. So this pattern here is essentially like a couple of guard conditions before the main responsibility of this method, right? Which is to push into the array. So it's a common pattern. Usually you'll see it as errors thrown, not as return messages or return values. But I didn't want to get into having to throw error messages for the first week. So that comes back to a little bit of one of the questions on the board, which is, can you create a test to check for an error you deliberately throw? And the answer is always yes, yes you can. So have a go at that if you want to. What else? Okay, so then we have a plane, and we have to figure out. So at the moment, one of the sort of states of the system that I wanted you to think about was if you land a plane at a different airport, at the moment, this program would still be able to land that same plane in another airport, because we're not checking the status of the plane. Right, you can land a plane at airport number 2, and at the moment, as long as the airport is not full, you can still add the plane into here. So you can therefore have a plane that landed in 2 different airports. So as a result, we have to figure out a way to make sure we know what the status of each plane is, or where it is on the ground, or if it's in the air. So the other part to this challenge was to think about how can we do something like adding another condition here. And do something like if plane dot is landed. And having one more check in here. As a result, we need to find a way to make sure we have a plane class that's able to track its own state. And if it does get landed, then we tell it to land itself. And we'll have a look at what this plane can do in a second. At the moment, we've written two methods, is landed and land, and we'll have a look at what this plane can do. In the same way, I'm not worrying about the takeoff because the takeoff is pretty much the inverse of the land, right? So if we have a class for the plane, we have to think about the one thing that it's meant to be responsible for is knowing whether it's landed or not. So in our constructor for the plane, we can have something that's like, we start off, I guess, creating planes in midair, I guess, if they start off landed as false. Boom, plane in midair, all right? This is one of them. It's a contrived system, right? So don't worry about that. Jamie's put on the jumper because he's cold. Cool, okay, so we have a plane that needs to be responsible for its own state, whether it's landed, and we know that we have to write these two methods, is landed and land, to make this work. So let's start off with the land, which is simply to change this to true. And we have an is landed, some version of this that just returns, I guess, this property. So again, the purpose of this this object is simply to be a holder for a true or false value and for it to be updated when needed, so that we stop the land method at this point here if the plan's already landed. And so in this method, we take in a plane and then we send it a message saying is landed. If that's true, then we return this message. If it's false, then we keep going and we can add it to the plane, add it to this planes array. If we do manage to get to this point, this property is false, and therefore we have to set it to true. So if we were to do this again, it would then give us the right outcome. And this is the way that we can use two objects together. We can pass it as an argument and then call methods on it in that method body, and make sure that we're keeping the state of our system correct. Thoughts?
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is landed function there?
Yeah.
Why would you not just call straight to the constructor value there?
Yeah, you could do. It's entirely public, so you can. The idea is we're trying to give a signal to people reading our code that we want to use public methods, is landed and land, rather than directly modifying the properties or reading from them. All right.
Yeah.
So it's just it's a good habit to get into. But you're absolutely right that you could not worry about this and just directly modify that property. But it's not very good practice. We should always try to think about using functions as like the interface to our objects.
Cool.
Yeah, a quick question. Would you rather like create a function called is landed instead of a getter for landed?
Entirely up to you. This is where it becomes more personal opinion. I don't like getters and setters in the way that Node.js implements them, so I'll always prefer to write my own. But absolutely, you can do. All right, and that question really is more about what if you end up in a team that writes using Node.js, what they prefer.
Why don't you like them?
Because they add a layer of sort of obfuscation. They are essentially properties that already still map to functions. So you might as well just write a function itself. It's like a convenient hack around the fact that the properties are available. The pattern here is actually not use the properties in the way that we're doing it here and have a different way to do it, but sort of class syntax in JavaScript is sugar over closures, which is a whole different topic that we'll get into in a few weeks' time to explore that. So the main takeaway here is as long as you're using functions, whether they are getters or setters in Node.js or these kinds of getters and setters that I've written here, it's absolutely fine. All right. More thoughts or questions? The real key thing here at the moment when you read this is to make sure we understand this part here and this part here. Does it make sense what this is doing and why? If it doesn't, ask and we're going to go through it again, or as much time as needed. This is recorded, so you can have a look at it in your own time later. The last part, if we had to think about the weather, if you got there, is to have another class for weather. Let's keep it super simple. And let's say it has a is stormy method. And let's say for the moment, it always returns true for simplicity's sake. The way that we could use this is to inject it here and say something like weather is a new instance of weather, maybe. Store it. Yeah. And then in these checks, you could add another one here at the very top. I'll just write it by itself. It will be part of this condition. And if this dot weather is stormy, etc., etc., etc. So this pattern for this challenge was simply just being able to recognize, trying to find a way to have a bunch of different guard conditions, and then at the end push the plane in, or in the other way, have a bunch of guard conditions for the takeoff method and then remove the plane. Excuse me, at the end, figuring out a way that we can use the first sort of extension to that was using the plane, track its own state, and the second extension was using the weather to decide whether it's true or false for stormy, and making them play together. I think those were extensions though, so that's not to worry about for this challenge. The main part was this part here. Anything else that came up that we want to go through for this challenge?
Yes, could I have a question about the weather class?
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about implementing it, like in my head, I thought it would be a random thing. So every time you would call it, like it would be either sunny or stormy. And for that, I would have used like a random number generator.
Nice. Absolutely.
But then like I was kind of unable to write up the test case for it because like obviously I never knew what I'm gonna get. So I'm not really sure like why you wrote like the logic behind the way you wrote up this weather class now. Because for me like it doesn't seem random. I'm not sure if
it's not random at all. I just wanted to keep it simple, so I didn't want to get into that for the moment. So absolutely a random case. And if you got stuck at the point of figuring out how to test for randomness, that's exactly where I want you to be. All right, so that's intended, and it's a good thing to think about. And I'll go over it probably when more people have got to that stage. All right. The idea behind testing randomness is we have to make sure we control every test needs to run exactly the same every time you run it. So if you have random behavior, that violates that rule. So we have to find a way to control random behavior. But we're going to get onto that when we dive into a little bit more about mocking and stubbing for tests. And so we'll do that this week. All right. But if that's where you got to, that's really good. All right. More thoughts or questions at the moment?
Is there a better way to get around all these guard functions so you don't end up with a really long lines and lines of code checking like everything?
This one arguably shouldn't be here. It should be in the plain class to figure out the plain state. At the moment, because we're returning strings, not throwing errors, it has to be here rather than over there. So when we throw errors, that can now move onto the other part. Otherwise, anything that's to do with the plain state has to be anything to do with the airport state has to be in this class. So isFull is airport state because it checks the planes array. This also checks the planes array, so it has to be in this class. This one checks the plain state, so arguably it should be in the other class. All right. And then other things you could do is to build like a validator or some kind of object to handle the validation. And that's another sort of like abstraction that we can pull out here if you wanted to remove code from this method. So you would do something like I don't know. You would have to have something like create an object. Let's say usually some kind of pattern that looks like this. If it's true, then we can land it. Otherwise, we can't. All right, and then you would encapsulate all the logic behind an object with a method, for example. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions at the moment? Anything else that would be useful for you to update or improve your own airport challenges at the moment? Cool. I don't think there's anything else I can think of when I was looking through your challenges. So let's stop the screen share there. And let's spend another hour individually working on your airport challenge to extend it or to keep going with it. Given that you now have a bunch of comments from each other and we've gone through the sort of cohort review. Let's spend some time for another hour until 12, and then I want to introduce what we're doing this afternoon this week. Sound good? Cool. Any questions for me?
Yeah, I just had the question about the private properties.
Oh, sorry.
Is that a possibility?
Yes, you can make private properties.
Is it the hashtag thing?
There's a version of JavaScript or a version of, yes, 2019 or 2020, I can't remember which version it is, that's introduced private properties. Now, the thing to remember is there's about 6 or 7 different versions of JavaScript over the past 5 to 10 years. So not all browsers and not all systems will recognize the way that Node.js writes private properties. So feel free to use them if you want to. There's a different way to hide properties or hide variables, and it's not using the class syntax. It's going back to thinking about functional sort of function scope and hiding variables within functions. But that gets us down to the road of thinking about closures. So if you're interested, Jamie, go have a look at how closures work in JavaScript and how that can help solve that problem. That's probably a good use of your time. And I would stay away at the moment from using private properties as you're probably looking at in Node.js for the moment. I don't think it's that useful.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, until it becomes much more standard.
Cool. Thanks.
Anything else? Sweet. All right. Go work on your Apple challenge for a bit, and then let's get back at 12 o'clock. I'll introduce what we're doing for the rest of today this week.